Welcome to Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237 Teamsters. Today, our very special guest is the esteemed District Attorney from the County of Nassau, Kathleen Rice.
Hello, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for appearing. I believe you may be our first guest from the island.
All right.
On the show that's an elected official.
Makes me very happy. Happy to be here.
For our listeners and our viewers, because most of our listeners are in New York City, and we have a few in Long Island, they're not familiar with the District Attorney of Nassau County. And a few years ago, you had, and I call it your signature piece, you were featured in CBS on 60 Minutes, and you were focusing on DWI drivers. And there was a tragic case, I would say maybe 7 or 8 years ago in Nassau County, and I remember you taking that to heart, where a family had just attended a wedding, and the wedding party was interrupted by a drunk driver who killed several of the people who participated in the wedding, several family members, including a young child, a young girl. And you've made that your signature case, and you've done great work for advocating that people do not drink and drive. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. You know, when I ran for the first time for DA in 2005, I had spent my career as both a state and federal prosecutor. And during that campaign and every day since, I've spoken about the epidemic of drunk driving, because that's what it is, Greg, not just here in New York, but all across the country. And in Nassau County, because it's a more suburban county, we have, on average, over 4,000 DWIs every year. And when Katie Flynn was decapitated by a drunk driver when she was coming home from being a flower girl in her aunt's wedding, along with the driver of the limousine she was in being killed, Stanley Rabinowitz, this case got enormous attention. We prosecuted the defendant and charged him with murder. He was convicted of murder, and he received a sentence of 18 years to life. But in the aftermath of that case, we went up to Albany to get better laws on the books, because it was a huge vacuum in the law that allowed drunk drivers who kill people to get anywhere from probation and the more rare instance of a sentence like 18 years to life. Now we have 2 new crimes that allow drunk drivers, the worst of the worst, who kill and seriously injure people, to be held more accountable. And I'm going to keep talking about this until we experience the cultural shift that we need to, and people stop accepting DWI as a socially acceptable crime.
Now, prior to that, the laws were lax, and basically DWI drivers got a slap on the wrist.
Very often, they would, for their first offense, be able to plead down to what would be the equivalent of a traffic infraction, and they'd have to pay a fine, similar to a fine that you would have to pay if you were speeding. And my opinion is that kind of attitude and treating drunk drivers like that and letting them get a slap on the wrist sent the message to them, certainly, that this was not a serious offense. So we had a very high rate of recidivism. 7 out of 10 drunk drivers were recidivist drunk drivers. And my approach, my change in that policy and not allowing plea bargaining if you are above a certain limit, has really cut down on the amount of DWIs we have. We also started employing and asking judges to install ignition interlocks, which is technology that prevents a drunk driver from starting a car. It's just smart stuff. And we're going to keep fighting for laws like that.
Now, how does that get installed in the car? You catch somebody driving drunk, and the law says that you have to have this installed in your car?
This is a new law that was passed 2 years ago called Leandra's Law. It was named for a little girl named Leandra Rosado, who died here in Manhattan, I believe, when the van that she was driving in, being driven by a woman who was drunk, drove off the road. She was thrown from the van and she was killed. And her father, Lenny, this was his only child, and he went on a campaign, a passionate campaign up to Albany to get legislators to pass what's called Leandra's Law. Leandra's Law did 2 things. It made it a felony for anyone to drive drunk with a child in the car, because they are truly a hostage. They cannot do anything to keep themselves safe or get themselves out of a car. And number 2, it made it mandatory for any person convicted of the misdemeanor drunk driving, even as a first offense, to have installed in their car an ignition interlock for a 6-month period. And this ignition interlock is put in by the company that manufactures them. It's paid for by the defendant. And what it requires the defendant to do is to blow into a device that will detect any alcohol on the defendant's breath. And if there is alcohol, will prevent the car from starting. It also calls for rolling retests if you're in the car for 20 minutes, an hour, where you have to, during at intermittent periods, blow in again. And this is a way of keeping the worst of the worst drunk drivers off the road and holding them accountable and trying to change the behavior that has taken far too many lives on our roads.
Can this be installed for the parents who are worried about their children driving drunk?
Well, you could go out and buy a device like this and put it in your car. The good thing about kids these days, statistically, 10% of drunk drivers are under the age of 18 or 21. So the vast majority of drunk drivers are people our age, adults that should know better. Kids are getting unprecedented education on DWI. We have a program where we go into the high schools. It's called Choices and Consequences. And we try to explain to kids who don't have fully developed brains, they don't understand risk, and they think they're going to live forever. So they make decisions based on that thought that they're going to live forever and that no danger is going to come to them. So our program shows them pictures and has people come in, both defendants who have driven drunk and victims' families, to talk to them about the realities of it. And I think that goes a long way in ensuring that young kids have a designated driver program.
In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, a lot of us remember the storm, and a lot of us remember that the utility companies were either non-responsive or they just didn't seem to have a plan to get the state back to work. Get power back to the state. Yeah. You've been appointed by the governor to the Morland Commission. Can you tell us about your work on that commission?
Sure. I was very happy to be appointed by the governor. There is a 10-member commission. I am the only person from Long Island, and as a result of Sandy's effect specifically on the South Shore of Long Island, I'm very proud to be representing everyone from Long Island on this commission. Our first goal was to look at LIPA, which has become one of the most powerful 4-letter words on Long Island that there is. It is a public utility that contracts out for the operation of their transmission and distribution system to an operation called National Grid. And what our commission has found is that splitting up the ownership and the operation of the system led to no one being held accountable. And what you have is customers who are paying some of the highest rates in the country getting some of the worst service. And that reason there was the bad service was because there was not sufficient storm preparedness. There wasn't a sufficient response once it was done. Technology is just not a word in LIPA's vocabulary. They're still using paper maps and sending people out with paper maps. I mean, crazy situation that contributed to the incredible length of time it took to get the power back on. But the broader mission of the Moreland Commission is also to look at private utilities like Con Ed and PSE&G that operate throughout the state, and also the regulatory agencies that oversee them, specifically the Public Service Commission. The problem with LIPA is that they're not overseen by anyone other than their board because they're a public utility. The PSC oversees all the private utilities. So what our goal is by the end of March is to come up with an assessment of how each of the utilities did all across the state, not just in Sandy, but in Irene and the ice storm and the blackout. And this goes back a couple of years. And how we can give real teeth to the regulatory agency known as the Public Service Commission, because that is the goal. It's to have regulation, not that stifles business, because that's not what we want to do, but that enables utilities and public or private to be held accountable in the event that they don't perform for the customer who is already paying some of the highest rates in the country. So I'm very happy to be on this commission. It's been quite a learning experience, and I saw firsthand the devastation in places like Long Beach in my own backyard, and people need relief, and hopefully our suggestions will ensure that this kind of reaction never happens again.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this segment of Reaching Out. Our very special guest was Kathleen Rice, the Nassau County District Attorney. I'm Gregory Floyd. Thank you for watching and listening.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay.